My name is Zsofia Budai, and I work at the U.S. Embassy here in Moscow. I'm joining you from my apartment, even though I have this wonderful picture of the Kremlin behind me since we're working from home. But thanks for being with me today and with us today. The American Center has plenty of fantastic programming for you, even during we all have to stay home during quarantine. So today, I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm very much a Civil War and a U.S. military history buff. I have a master's degree in military studies, so I've studied this battle and many other battles. Now, I'm not the world's leading expert, but I'll try to answer as many questions as you have. And I'll talk a little more generally so that even if you don't have a lot of context, a lot of background, you'll understand. So I think this is a great topic to address as we near Victory Day, just coming up in a few days. Now that celebrates the end of World War II, but of course, it's important to look at some of the wars that came before. And for the United States, really one of the most defining, if not the most defining, one of them is the American Civil War, which, if you have my first slide up, you can see the dates lasted from 1861 to 1865, and it's really was the costliest war in U.S. history, definitely until then, and even afterwards, given how many casualties there were. And it was really a defining time period for the history of the United States. Next slide, please. So to put the Battle of Gettysburg in context, we have to look at the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. The Battle of Gettysburg was actually in the middle of that in 1863. So the war lasted for 2 more years after that. But the Battle of Gettysburg became the turning point, and it really was something from which the losing side, the South, the Confederate States of America, never recovered. So if you look at the history of the Civil War, we see that it was, you have the map right there, but you see that it was a battle between the northern states, the Union, and the southern states, the Confederate States of America. And you can see those in red. And really the defining issue for the Civil War was the battle over slavery and whether or not states and the United States had the right to continue the enslavement of people who had been captured and brought in from Africa. So, of course, there were many different issues that were related to slavery, but this was something that it was an issue that hadn't been resolved for the entirety of the United States' history up until that point. And it finally broke out into the Civil War that in 1861. Now, Abraham Lincoln was the president during the entire Civil War. He was reelected in 1864, and he was really credited as the leader for who led the country, who kept the Union together. That was his goal, was keeping the country together and maintaining the United States as a country, because it was less than 100 years old at that point, and had the Union lost the Civil War, the entire country would have fallen apart, and who knows what would have happened then. So during the Civil War, of course, there were many battles fought, and the Battle of Gettysburg, as I mentioned, was the turning point. Let's go to the next slide, please. The Gettysburg Campaign. So to put this into context, the Battle of Gettysburg took place in July of 1863, and it was preceded by the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, where the Southern Army, which was the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee, who you see on the screen, really had a decisive victory over the Union forces, the Federals. And at this point, buoyed by this victory, General Lee decided to embark on a second invasion of the North. Now, the Battle of Chancellorsville was fought in Virginia. It's a little bit hard to see on the map, I admit, but that's Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. It's kind of the it's the eastern coast of the U.S. The Battle of Chancellorsville had been fought in Virginia. Now, Virginia was the heart of the Confederacy. The capital of the Confederate States was in Richmond. General Lee himself was from Virginia, and he commanded the Army of Northern Virginia. And much of the fighting up until then had taken place in Virginia. So he had already one failed invasion of the North under his belt, but this was really, he was trying to build on his victory and begin the Gettysburg Campaign, which started in June of 1863 and culminated with the Battle of Gettysburg in July. Now, there were many reasons why Lee embarked on this Gettysburg Campaign. You can see the red arrows represent the Army of Northern Virginia under General Lee, and how they made their way north through kind of a little bit more inland through the Shenandoah Valley, whereas the blue represents the Union troops who made their way north further along the coast. Before meeting at the Battle of Gettysburg. But there were a number of reasons why General Lee decided to invade the North. Part of the reason was because Virginia had seen so many battles, and the state was really depleted in that fields had been destroyed, agriculture destroyed. There wasn't a lot of food left for his army. That was really just basically needed more provisions for the army. But also it was an attempt to force the northern states to seek out some sort of compromise with the South. Lee was hoping that by invading the North, and making it as far as Pennsylvania, perhaps to Philadelphia, or even further north, he would force the Union into some sort of compromise. And of course, he was buoyed by the victory at Chancellorsville, so he and his troops were feeling pretty confident. And now Major General Meade, George Meade, who's the gentleman in the middle, commanded the Army of the Potomac, which was the Union troops, the federal army. He had only taken command a few days before the Battle of Gettysburg. You can see most of the movement from Chancellorsville by the Union troops, the blue arrows, was not under his command. It had been under the command of Major General Joseph Hooker, but Abraham Lincoln was not happy with Hooker and replaced him with Meade just a few days before the Battle of Gettysburg. So most of the Gettysburg campaign was Lee versus Hooker's army, but then it was Meade who took over. And there were a couple of skirmishes between elements of both armies on the way to Gettysburg, but nothing major. It was not until the very end of June, when the two armies met in Gettysburg, that the battle began. Now, how big were the armies? They were substantial. The Army of the Potomac was around 100,000 troops, and the Army of Northern Virginia was around 75,000 troops. They were organized differently in that Major General Meade had 7 infantry corps under his command, one cavalry corps, and an artillery reserve. Lee had 3 infantry corps commanders, infantry corps under his command, and 1 cavalry division. He had lost his most important general, Stonewall Jackson, back at Chancellorsville. So he was working with not new commanders, but several of whom had just been promoted and with whom he hadn't had that established relationship. But these were 2 huge armies, and obviously they didn't move as one monolithic army. Different elements moved at different times in different ways. And they met at Gettysburg. Next slide, please, which has the 3 maps on it. They met at Gettysburg really the evening of June 30th, pretty much by accident. It was not where Lee had intended to go, and it's not where he had intended to engage the Army of the Potomac. But as you can see, Gettysburg, if you look on the maps, Gettysburg is kind of in the middle. The town of Gettysburg, it's a junction where many roads met. So because different elements from both armies were taking those roads, they ended up meeting, and that's where the battle took place. So Really, it took place over the course of 3 days, and you have the maps showing how it happened with excuse me, with the Army of the Potomac represented in blue as the winners, and the Army of Northern Virginia in red. So the fighting escalated throughout the first day, July 1st, really kind of began June 30th, but official start of those were just a few skirmishes. Official start of the battle is July 1st, and it escalated throughout the day. And as you can see, it took place mainly in the north, to the north of the town of Gettysburg. The Confederates attacked the Union troops that were there, and now there were only two Union corps that had infantry corps that had already made it, and I believe two or elements of two Confederate ones. So definitely it wasn't the entire armies. There were elements of the two armies. It was a bad day for the Union troops. They suffered fairly heavy casualties, including some of their top leaders, such as General Reynolds, who led the First Corps, and they had to retreat through the town of Gettysburg. You see them going south. A number of them were captured on that retreat. And it was really during the night where the main elements of both armies arrived, including the leaders, Generals Lee and Meade, and they really established their positions during the night. Day 2 and day 3 were really when the heavy fighting began, or really took place. You can see day 2 in the middle of the map. The Union lines were in a defensive position, kind of resembling a fishhook, sort of. You can see with the blue. And Lee had engaged on a heavy assault on the left flank, and as well as assaults on the right flank. So there were pretty heavy assaults. But despite the significant losses, the Union troops held the lines, and they were able to defend their positions. So it was really during the night when Lee had to come up with a new strategy for how to attack the next day, because he had not enjoyed the success that he had hoped on the second day. So third day, fighting resumed. Cavalry battles also raged. The Confederate cavalry had made it to the battle. Finally, they were a little late and wandering around somewhere else, which contributed to their loss. It was the last effort by the Confederates was really Pickett's charge, which you can see a little bit to the left, where General Pickett's infantry attacked the Union line on Cemetery Ridge unsuccessfully. They were repulsed, and it was really kind of the last attempt by the Confederate troops to defeat the Union here, which they were unsuccessful doing. Lee was crippled by heavy losses and decided to retreat the next day. So that's the overview. Now, of course, entire books have been written about these 3 days, or even one day. So I can get more into some of what went on if anyone is interested. But let's move on to the next slide. During these 3 days of heavy fighting, a lot went on. This is actually a really large area. The Battle of Gettysburg took place, and different units were holding different parts and attacking different parts of the area, and a lot of stories came out of it. And one of the most well-known and most well-loved is the Battle on Little Round Top, which took place the second day, so that would have been July 2nd, and it really turned the man that you see there, Colonel Chamberlain, the commander of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment, into a hero. His story is interesting because, like a number of others who fought in the Battle of Gettysburg, he was not a professional soldier. In fact, most of the soldiers were not professionals, except for the generals who led. He had been a professor at a university or a college in Maine, but like many others, he decided he needed to do his part and fight. Later on, he actually became governor of Maine, so he had a pretty impressive career after the Civil War. But he didn't have a background as a soldier. He didn't have a background in the military. But he is credited as being someone who was a really good leader and whose actions had a decisive impact on the Battle of Gettysburg. So the 20th Maine, I don't know if you can see it, it's to the very end of that blue line, 20th ME. That is where his commander, Colonel Strong Vincent, had put his regiment, and he only had about 300, 400 people. And he was told he needed to hold that position at all costs, because if he couldn't hold it on Little Round Top, the entire Union line would collapse. So his men repulsed several attacks by Confederate troops, mainly the 15th Alabama Infantry Regiment. You see that, but the fighting was still going on when they realized they were completely out of ammunition. And they didn't know what to do. They were on top of a hill. You see that in the photo there. So they had the advantage from that point of view, but without ammunition, there wasn't much they could do to hold it. What he ordered his men to do was fix their bayonets and counterattack by running down the hill and attacking the Confederate troops. And it worked. This frontal assault, this flanking maneuver, surprised the Confederate troops, and they ended up being able to hold Little Round Top and hold off the Confederate troops. So Chamberlain ended up winning a Medal of Honor. So there were many interesting stories like this throughout the battle, which lasted 3 days. But moving away from Chamberlain, let's go to the next slide, please. The aftermath. So Lee's army, Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederates start to retreat on the 4th of July, which is actually the founding of the United States. So national holiday. Spirits were definitely high among the Union troops and low among the Confederates. Overall, they suffered a staggering number of casualties, both sides. That you can see there were about even, but because the Confederate army was smaller, that had the Army of Northern Virginia, it was a higher percentage of casualties. And battlefield photography, which was really developed in the United States during the Civil War, captured with dead soldiers. It was a decisive victory for the Army of the Potomac. Now, I put decisive, I put a question mark after that because historians disagree about whether or not it was decisive. It did end up being the turning point in the Civil War, because it was the second and the last time that Lee ended up attacking the North. And after that, looking back, it's easy to say after that the Confederates had lost, but the war did go on for 2 more years. Something historians also debate is, did Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, win, or did Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, lose? Now, of course, both are true, but historians have tended to focus on Lee and what he did wrong. Now, Meade was a very good commander, and even though he was new to leading the Army of the Potomac, he made a lot of decisions that ended up winning him the battle, even though he has been criticized for not pursuing Lee as Lee retreated and destroying the Army of Northern Virginia. But really, Meade proved himself to be a very good general, a very good commander, a very good leader during the Battle of Gettysburg. And of course, Lee also proved himself to be not quite as good as people had thought. His reputation at the time, and even now, and among some segments of society in the United States, was that he was a brilliant general, that he was invincible, that he was so smart and so competent that he couldn't lose. I mean, he could lose some battles, but overall he he would turn out to be the victor. And Gettysburg proved that that was not true. And in fact, there were a number of mistakes that he made, and whether they're mistakes you can say of his or mistakes in his leadership style and his communication with his corps commanders, they rest with him ultimately as the general responsible for the Army of Northern Virginia. But it showed, I mean, he was a little bit overconfident. He didn't communicate with his generals as well as he could have. Now, he had lost his closest general, his most competent one at the battle prior to that, Stonewall Jackson. So he had to work with people, with generals maybe he wasn't as comfortable with, but there were definitely mistakes that he made and mistakes that they made that lost the Confederate Army the battle, because they really had the upper hand at the beginning. They were doing quite well the first day. Now, moving away from that, the Battle of Gettysburg also gave us what is known as one of the most famous speeches in American history, President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So the scene for this was that in November, now that was a few months after the Battle of Gettysburg, he came out to commemorate the battlefield and to really try to show the importance of this battle to a nation. And this was while the war was still going on. But he gave a speech that was actually very short, but very eloquent about the importance of the Battle of Gettysburg. And I have a quote up here, but it's worth reading in its entirety, because Lincoln was convinced that this was a decisive battle that would help preserve the Union, which was, of course, his goal as president, is preserve the Union and bring the nation back together. Next slide, please. So the Battle of Gettysburg is now preserved. These are my photos from the last time that I was there about a year ago. In fact, 1 year ago in May of 2019, and it is preserved so that visitors can go and see it and tour it, see what it was like. You can see some of the fence, the historic style of fence in one of the photos. There are a lot of memorials to individual generals, to individual commanders, to various regiments. You can tour the entire place and see where everything took place. In the photo in the middle to the bottom where I am, that's actually Little Round Top, or the bottom of Little Round Top, and those are the woods through which the Confederates attacked the 20th Maine, held that at the very end of the Union line there. So it's really a fascinating place, and when you get the chance to travel to Pennsylvania, if you get the chance to travel, I highly recommend visiting the battlefield. It's just such an important part of history, and it's so well preserved. Next slide, please. And this is actually my final slide. I hope I've given you a little bit of taste of the Battle of Gettysburg, but there's so much more to learn, and I've read a number of books about the battle, but by Alan Gulzo. It's very well written, that lays out the battle and what led up to it. If you're more interested in the leadership aspect, the command aspect, how military leaders took decisions and what those decisions led to, you should read the Gettysburg Campaign, A Study in Command, that really focuses on the commanders by Coddington. And of course, you have to watch the classic movie from 1993 called Gettysburg. That's the one in the middle. It was filmed on the battlefield, battlegrounds there, and it was really something that I highly recommend. Has classic lines, and the actors are really fantastic. And then I also wanted to point out a couple of books that I own. Gettysburg. This is a really great book that I picked up actually at the Visitor Center, which has a lot of maps that go pretty much not just day by day, but like hour by hour, minute by minute of where the different units moved and what they were doing when. I also recommend looking into the leaders. Now, I got a book recently about General James Longstreet. Longstreet was the commander of First Corps under Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. He basically became the second in command after Stonewall Jackson was killed in Chancellorsville. And it's fascinating to read about his life, but also how much of a hated figure he became later on in the South after the war, because he was seen as having made some critical mistakes in Gettysburg. And he was actually quite outspoken afterwards about the mistakes that the Army of Northern Virginia had made. And I had also a lot of criticism for the Confederate States of America as a whole. So he became not such a loved figure, but it's a lot of his writings have survived, and it's fascinating to read about his life. And I also recommend this book about General Grant. Now, he was not at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was nowhere near there, but he was the one who eventually took command of the Union Army, and he was the one to whom Lee surrendered in 1865 and then became president of the United States. But those are the books that I have on hand to recommend. First, watch Gettysburg, the movie. So I'm happy to take questions. I can try to answer them as best as I know. I don't remember all the details and all the names from the Battle of Gettysburg. So if you have some questions about that, I'd have to tell you to look them up. But if there are specific questions, I'm happy to take them.
You have to wait some time.
Okay. I'd say if you're interested in history, it's definitely some of my favorite places to visit in the United States are battlefields, especially Civil War battlefields, but there are other ones as well, because they are well preserved, and the visitor center does a great job telling the story of the battles. Sometimes you can even go and see reenactments, which are also fascinating to watch. If there are no questions, I can talk about other battles of the Civil War. Who, in your opinion, is the most controversial figure in this battle? Well, that is quite the difficult question. Thank you, of course, for the question. Now, it's interesting that you asked that, partly because the book about Longstreet is subtitled "The Confederacy's Most Controversial Soldier." Now, that's for a number of reasons, including what he did and said after the Civil War. But during the Battle of Gettysburg, I mean, a lot, I'd say, from the historical perspective, historians have divided the blame between different Confederate commanders fairly equally. Now, of course, Lee was ultimately the one responsible, but he had three corps commanders, Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill. He also had the commander of a cavalry division, Jeb Stuart, who actually sat out most of the battle because he was elsewhere and came in later. So he ended up being criticized for that. But in terms of controversial, I'm just going to go with Lee as the commander of the Confederate Army. There were a number of mistakes in communication that he made with his corps commanders, where he hinted at something and they either didn't do it or did later because they didn't know that he actually did want it done, or he himself didn't take the action. So I think the fact that he was seen and is still seen as a brilliant commander, really invincible, you have to look at the mistakes he made at Gettysburg. Now, that he did a lot of things right in different battles, and he was overall a good commander in a lot of respects. But I think the Battle of Gettysburg really shows that he doesn't deserve the reputation of being as brilliant and competent as history has kind of maintained. So I'd say he would be the most controversial. Now, at lower levels, you can look at different people. You can look at even General Pickett and Pickett's charge, and some of the mistakes that happened there. Although he was not he was not the one who made that decision, even though Pickett's charge is it's named after him. But overall, he was also a controversial soldier for many other reasons. But I'll go with Lee. I'm sorry, there were a couple questions that popped up that I didn't catch. Let me see. Oh, sorry. Question 2, there we go. Russia played a role of a kind of Lincoln's ally during their war. What do you know about that? That's a great question, because aside from the fact that I know Lincoln corresponded quite regularly with Tsar Alexander II, I don't know what the actual relationship between the two nations was like. They did, Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II did communicate quite regularly, and they did discuss a number of issues that were pertinent to both of their countries, which included, for the United States, slavery, and for the Russian Empire, serfdom. But I don't know enough about their relationship and how Russia supported the United States during the Civil War to answer that. That would be it would be fascinating to know more about that, and I'd like to learn more about that. Question 3. You told that Lincoln changed Hooker for me just a few days before the Battle of Gettysburg, as he wasn't happy with Hooker in this position. What does that mean, wasn't happy? It's a good question. Hooker and Lincoln, as far as I understand, never had a very good relationship. Hooker had been in command of the Union Army at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and he lost that battle. Now, there were other people who were responsible for that and who made mistakes, but ultimately it was Hooker who had lost the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was only 2 months prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. So I think that that was something that Lincoln very much had in mind, and I think there might have been personal conflicts. Now, Hooker had a reputation as a really kind of a larger-than-life character who had a lot of personal faults, and that might have also been detrimental to the relationship. But I don't want to speculate how much that impacted things, but I think it was kind of the loss at Chancellorsville, and looking forward and Lincoln was really considering who would be best to lead the Union Army, the Army of the Potomac at that point, and he decided Hooker was not it. All right, we have a comment. Russia provided the U.S. with a military fleet to blockade a possible military help to the south from part of UK and France. Thank you. I appreciate that comment, because I did not know that. As you mentioned in this comment, the South was trying to get the United Kingdom and France involved in the war on their side. They actually stopped exporting cotton to especially the UK to try to get the UK to try to persuade them to jump in on the war on the side of the South and support them materially, with troops, economically. However, that support never materialized, but there were a lot of ongoing negotiations. And that was something that the Union feared, was that the South would get help from other countries. Question 4. What is the significance of the Gettysburg Address? That is also a very good question, and a very valid question, because it has gone down in history as one of the most well-known, one of the most important addresses. Now, the scene here is that, Lincoln came out to the battlefield a couple months after the battle. It was still, the town of Gettysburg was basically destroyed, and the surrounding area was destroyed, and it still was destroyed. So it affected the civilian population, of course, there, and it was very much fresh in their minds, as well as the horrific losses on both sides were very much fresh in people's minds. And the war was continuing. So that was the context. Something else you have to realize was that there were speakers before Lincoln who, talked for hours and hours about, go Union, we will win the war. He actually said in the text, if you look at it, he actually spoke very, very much in generalities and very much in kind of why. He didn't say Civil War, he didn't say Gettysburg, he didn't say Union Army, he didn't say Meade, he didn't say Lee. He didn't give any of these details. He spoke very generally about the fact that this war is a battle for the survival of the nation that was established less than 100 years at that point as basically an experiment. And so many men have given their lives since he was in Gettysburg to preserve the Union, to preserve the nation, to preserve this American experiment. And it was a very short speech, but it was a very, very moving speech that really got to the heart of why, what are we fighting for and why is this so important? So definitely read it if you haven't read it. It's very short. It's like 250 words. Is there another? Okay. Can you tell us more about how the Civil War and its legacy, for example, war memorials, is viewed now by different groups of Americans? All right, well, that is a very good question, because the Civil War is still very much a part of the U.S. history, U.S. legacy. And even though it happened, now 150, 160 years ago, it's U.S. history is fairly short. We're a fairly young country, and it was such a decisive turning point in the history of the country that it is still viewed. It is still very important to a lot of people. Now, one of the things that Lincoln himself, although he was assassinated, let's say in 1865, so he really wasn't able to oversee the aftermath of the Civil War as much as he wanted to. But one of the things that the U.S. government has been criticized for is really not doing enough to bring the nation together afterwards and to kind of heal the old wounds. Now that's debatable, but in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there was still a lot of resentment in the South, and part of that had to do, of course, with losing the war. Part of that had to do with the very real economic losses, with the human losses. I mean, every family had members that they had lost, so there was a lot of pain. But it also had to do with losing the industry, or losing the institution that a lot of Southern industry was dependent on, which was slavery. So there was a lot of resentment about that, and part of that was economic, and part of that was very much racial, because so many of Southerners did not see African Americans as equal members of society, and resented the fact that that they were free and that they were now viewed as American just like anyone else. That there was a lot of continuing racism in both the North and the South that led to a lot of issues. But there was a lot of resentment in the South after the war, and to be honest, some of that continues to this day. Now, we're 160 years removed, so no one personally has a grandfather who fought in the war or anything like that, but people do have family history that they refer back to. And the war memorials are, of course, very much controversial. Robert E. Lee himself did not want war memorials. He wanted the nation to move past the war, to move on. It happened. He did not want the South as the losing side to be commemorated. But a lot of these war memorials were established to the Southern states, or to the Confederates. In the Southern states, mainly to Confederate soldiers, were established a couple decades after the Civil War. And they are controversial to this day because it was the Confederate States of America was the army that attacked and tried to defeat the Army of the United States of America, and represented goals, obviously, that of maintaining slavery that are seen as reprehensible today, and were seen as reprehensible by many people, of course in the Union, but also in the South somewhat back then. So it continues to be a controversial topic to this day, because there are memorials to Southern generals and to Southern troops and to the Confederate Army, and of course there was a Confederate flag, which was only one of the flags that was used by the Confederate Army, but that is still very much controversial to this day. Now, another question. Can you comment on the role of women in the Civil War? Did they play any role at all, as they did in World War II, for example? Well, thank you for that question. And I think it's a fascinating topic to research, because women certainly played a very important role, but I'm not an expert, so I don't want to overstate my knowledge on that. There were a number of women who, because they wanted to fight, cut their hair short and dressed up as men and actually enlisted in the army. And a number of them were killed or were injured, and their identities as women were not discovered until they were being treated by doctors or they were being buried. Of course, that was a small number compared to overall, but really women were responsible for keeping the home going. I think a really great book that I recommend is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and it's about a mother and her 4 daughters during the Civil War, while the husband/father is off fighting in the Civil War. And it's a really great book about how they, the difficulties they faced, but how they thrived, how they kept the communities together. And I know there's a new movie out that people have said is good. So I think women played a very important role, especially back as civilians, in keeping the town, the farm, the life going, because especially as the Confederate Army started losing more and more people, I mean, basically any man between the ages of 15 and 50 fought in the war. So during the war and then after the war, dealing with those losses, women were very important to keeping their communities together, helping the war effort. There were many nurses, including in field hospitals, who were women and who were treating the wounded. So I think it's a great topic. I don't know enough about it beyond that. All right, looks like we're good to wrap up now. Okay, then I'll just say a few final words. Thank you very much for joining me today, learning a little bit more about the Battle of Gettysburg and the American Civil War. I hope to maybe do a few more lectures on different battles in the Civil War, or maybe a different war. So thanks for joining, and remember that as programming, virtual programming all this month. I'm sure continuing into next month. So check out what's coming up on the American Center's website, and so always join us when you can.